She had been shot from behind through the driver's side headrest, causing a massive fatal head wound.
On April 7th, 2009, 23-year-old Charline Rosemond left home expecting to return that evening. She had a job. She had family waiting for her. She had plans for her future. And on that particular day, she had several $1,000s in cash because she believed she was about to purchase a Lexus. Nothing about the plan appeared extraordinary, but Charline never made it home. 6 days later, investigators found her inside her father's gray Honda Civic in a secluded parking area in Somerville, Massachusetts. She had been shot in the head, and the vehicle she had borrowed from her father had become the final scene of her life. For more than 15 years, the case remained a haunting question for her family. Who killed Charline Rosemond? But as investigators continued examining the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, another possibility emerged. Maybe Charline had not simply encountered the wrong person. Maybe she had been deliberately led into danger. According to prosecutors, the promise of a Lexus was allegedly used to lure her to a meeting. And at the center of that theory was someone Charline reportedly knew and trusted. Someone who allegedly knew she was carrying thousands of dollars. Someone prosecutors say was connected to the plan that ended with her death. Then, more than 15 years later, there was a breakthrough. One man was indicted, but another person prosecutors say was involved had already died, and the murder weapon was still missing. So even after all these years, one question continues to haunt the case. How did a young woman who thought she was going to buy a car end up inside her father's vehicle with a bullet in her head? This is the story of Charline Rosemond. And before we begin, if you value documentaries that give a voice to victims whose stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Black Girl Lost and stay with us through the end. Because Charline's story is not simply about how she died. It is about what happened before she disappeared, the people who allegedly knew where she was going, and why it took more than a decade and a half for the case to reach a courtroom. Charline Rosemond was only 23 years old, but she already had a picture of the life she wanted. She lived with her family in Everett, Massachusetts, and worked at a Toyota dealership in Brighton. To the people around her, she was not someone whose life seemed to be moving toward tragedy. She was building something. She was working. She was making plans. She was thinking about her future. Her family remembered her as energetic, adventurous, and courageous. She could bring energy into a room. She had interests outside her job, including cosmetology. She dreamed of eventually opening her own hair salon. There were ordinary milestones ahead of her. Family celebrations, relationships, responsibilities, a future she had not yet had the opportunity to experience. She was also looking forward to becoming an aunt. Her sister was preparing for a wedding, and Charline had every reason to believe she would be there to witness another important chapter in her family's life. Those details matter because murder investigations can quickly reduce a person to dates, locations, evidence, and accusations. But Charline was never a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with ambitions. And on the morning of April 7th, 2009, she woke up as that person. There was nothing about the day that announced what was coming. Charline normally used public transportation to get to work. But that day was different. She borrowed her father's gray Honda Civic. Her father needed the car back. Charline expected to return it. It was simply a temporary arrangement, a small change in routine. But small changes can become enormous in hindsight, because that gray Honda would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Charline went to work. She continued through what should have been an ordinary day. And then came the reason she had access to several $1,000s. She was interested in purchasing a Lexus. Charline had been discussing the vehicle with people she knew. A deal had apparently been presented to her. The price was attractive. The opportunity seemed real. And she believed she was going to look at the vehicle. She withdrew $4,100 in cash. Think about what that meant. She was not simply carrying a few dollars in her purse. She had a substantial amount of money with her because she expected to make a purchase. That fact would later become one of the most important pieces of the case. Because someone knew about the Lexus, someone knew about the meeting, and someone knew Charline would have money. At the time, however, Charline had no reason to believe she was walking toward danger. She believed she was handling business. She believed she was meeting people connected to a vehicle. And she trusted the people involved enough to go. That trust would become one of the darkest elements of the investigation. On April 7th, Charline went to work. Later that day, she began communicating with friends. The messages continued into the evening. At approximately 9:15 p.m., communication stopped. Then something even more alarming happened. Charline did not come home. For her family, this was not normal. A person can miss a call. A person can arrive late. A person can change plans. But when someone disappears without explanation, the ordinary assumptions begin to collapse. At first, there is uncertainty, then concern, then fear. Family members tried to reach her. They wanted to know where she was. They wanted to know when she would return. And as the hours passed, the unanswered questions became harder to ignore. Where was Charline? Why was she not responding? Who had last seen her? What had happened after she left work? Those questions became the beginning of a search. But the family did not yet know that the situation was already far more serious than a missing person case. Charline's disappearance was eventually reported to authorities. There has been criticism surrounding how quickly the disappearance was treated as an emergency, with family members later saying they were told they had to wait before authorities could take certain steps. That detail became painful in retrospect, because time matters enormously when someone disappears. Every hour can preserve a clue. Every unanswered phone call can become significant. Every location can tell investigators something. And every delay can create uncertainty. For Charline's loved ones, the waiting must have felt endless. They did not know whether she was safe, injured, or someone had taken her. They simply knew she was gone. Then the search stretched into another day, and another. For 6 days, her family lived without knowing the truth. 6 days of questions. 6 days of hoping. 6 days of imagining possibilities no family should ever have to consider. Then, on April 13th, everything changed. Investigators located Charline's father's Honda Civic in a secluded parking area near Union Square in Somerville. At first, the vehicle itself was a clue. Why was it there? Why had Charline not returned it? Why had it been abandoned? And then investigators looked inside. Charline was there. She was found slumped in the driver's seat. She had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. The search for a missing young woman had suddenly become a homicide investigation. The family had spent days hoping for her safe return. Instead, they were confronted with the worst possible answer. Charline was dead, and the vehicle she had borrowed from her father had become the place where investigators had to begin reconstructing her final moments. The crime scene raised disturbing questions. Investigators determined that the fatal shot came from behind Charline and passed through the driver's seat headrest. This suggests a particular position. Someone was behind her. Someone was close enough to fire from inside the vehicle. And Charline may not have seen the attack coming. Imagine the scene investigators were forced to reconstruct. A young woman sitting behind the wheel. A vehicle left away from the family's home. A fatal gunshot. No explanation for why she was there. And somewhere in that unanswered story was the reason she had left home carrying thousands of dollars. The money became critical. Charline had withdrawn $4,100 because she expected to purchase the Lexus. But that money was not recovered with her. If the cash was gone, then the reason for the meeting suddenly looked very different. Perhaps the Lexus was never the real objective. Perhaps the money was. But there was an even more disturbing possibility. What if the people involved did not have to search for Charline? What if they already knew exactly where she would be? What if someone she trusted had helped bring her there? To understand that possibility, investigators had to look beyond the parking lot. They had to go backward. They had to examine Charline's relationships. And one name began to matter. Roberto Jeune. Jeune was a close friend of Charline. That relationship changes the emotional character of the case. A stranger approaching someone with a weapon is terrifying. But a trusted person creating the circumstances for a deadly encounter is something else entirely. Trust lowers defenses. Trust creates access. Trust makes ordinary decisions feel safe. If someone you know tells you there is a car available for purchase, you are less likely to question the meeting. You may not ask why the location feels unusual. You may not think twice about who will be there. You may assume the person has your best interests in mind. That alleged trust was exploited. Investigators learned that Charline had been negotiating about the Lexus. The person connected to the deal was Jeune. Another man later became central to the prosecution's theory. His name was Anacreon. Jeune and Anacreon worked together to lure Charline to the meeting under the pretense that she was going to purchase a Lexus. The allegation is chilling because it turns an ordinary transaction into something much darker. Charline believed she was buying a vehicle. The people waiting for her had another objective: her money. This is where the case begins to look less like a random encounter and more like a planned sequence. First, identify something Charline wanted. Create an opportunity. Make the opportunity appear legitimate. Know when she will arrive. Isolate her. Then, take the money and eliminate the person who could identify those responsible. That is not an allegation of impulsive violence. It is an allegation of manipulation. And manipulation requires information. Someone needed to know enough about Charline's plans to make the meeting believable. Someone needed to know she had access to cash. Someone needed to make the location seem safe enough for her to appear. And someone had to understand how to get her there. That is why the relationship between Charline and the people connected to the supposed sale became so important. The question was no longer simply, who shot Charline? It became, who could have convinced her to walk into that situation? Investigators began working through the information surrounding the case, but the investigation did not produce an immediate arrest. Instead, the case entered a period that would last for years. Charline's family had to continue living with the absence. Her photograph could not tell them what happened. Her memories could not tell them who was responsible. The case existed, but answers remained out of reach. For Charline's loved ones, 15 years is difficult to comprehend. 15 years is enough time for children to grow into adults, enough time for careers to change, enough time for entire families to enter different stages of life. But Charline remained 23. Forever. The world moved forward. Her family had to move forward without her. And somewhere in the background, investigators continued trying to determine what had happened. Cold cases are difficult for a reason. Evidence can disappear. Memories become less precise. Witnesses move away. People die. Relationships change. And people who once knew something may no longer be available to explain what they knew. In Charline's case, that final problem became especially important. Roberto Jeune, the man who was involved in the alleged scheme, died in 2024. That meant one of the people authorities connected to the case would never face a trial. He would never sit before a jury. He would never be questioned under oath. He would never be forced to answer every allegation publicly. Whatever he knew about Charline's final hours went with him. Then came the breakthrough. In 2025, more than 15 years after Charline's death, Anacreon was indicted. The case that had remained unresolved for so long suddenly returned to the public spotlight. According to the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, Anacreon was indicted on first-degree murder and additional allegations involving attempts to mislead investigators. For Charline's family, this was a moment they had waited years to see. But an indictment is not a conviction. That distinction matters. Anacreon pleaded not guilty. The allegations against him must be proven in court. The prosecution has a theory. The defense has the right to challenge it. And the ultimate determination belongs to the judicial process. But the indictment nevertheless revealed how investigators believed the murder unfolded. Charline was lured to a Somerville parking area with the promise of purchasing a Lexus. She allegedly arrived with $4,100. The prosecution says the meeting was actually a setup. The money was allegedly taken, and Charline was shot. Then the vehicle was left behind. It is a devastating sequence, but prosecutors allege there was more. They say Anacreon was connected to the murder weapon. They also allege that he later celebrated the killing with champagne. That allegation is among the most disturbing details in the case. But again, it is an allegation presented by prosecutors. It has not been established as fact through a conviction. The firearm itself has not been recovered. And without the weapon, investigators are left to build their case through the evidence that remains. Investigators did not simply have a crime scene. They had a history. They had relationships. They had financial circumstances. They had a vehicle. They had a missing amount of cash. They had statements. They had allegations of deception. And eventually, they had a suspect facing an indictment. But even with all of that, there are questions that remain. What exactly happened when Charline arrived? Who was inside the vehicle? Who fired the weapon? Was Charline confronted immediately? Did she realize she had been deceived? Did she recognize the danger before it was too late? Was there an argument? Was she threatened? Did she have an opportunity to defend herself? Or did the attack happen so quickly that she never understood what was happening? These are unanswered questions. The person who could potentially provide another perspective is gone, and the defendant has pleaded not guilty.
38-year-old Heinske Anacreon arraigned on a murder charge for his role in the death of Charline Rosemond.
We all grew up together with my sister Charline, so I think it's just heart-wrenching that these people were the same people we grew up with and that they would plot and plan to murder my sister.
So the public is left with a prosecution theory that must still be tested. But there is another question. Why was the Lexus so important? The vehicle itself may seem like a minor detail. It was not. Without the Lexus, there may have been no reason for Charline to carry thousands of dollars. Without the supposed sale, there may have been no meeting. Without the meeting, there may have been no opportunity to isolate her. The Lexus therefore sits at the beginning of the chain. It represents the promise that allegedly brought Charline into danger. And that is what makes this case so painful. Charline was not allegedly approached with a warning. She was allegedly approached with an opportunity. A car, a deal, something she wanted, something that appeared useful, something that could improve her life. That is what makes alleged deception so powerful. It does not always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like exactly what you were hoping would happen. Charline had no reason to believe that a conversation about a Lexus would become connected to her death. She had no reason to believe that carrying cash would make her a target. And if prosecutors are correct about the alleged setup, she may not have realized the danger until it was too late. The victim was allegedly selected because she possessed something valuable, and the relationship around the transaction allegedly provided the access needed to make the plan work. This is why trust becomes such an important theme. People naturally protect themselves against strangers. They may ask questions. They may avoid secluded locations. They may refuse unusual requests. But when information comes through someone familiar, the psychological barrier is lower. That does not mean Charline was careless. It means she was human. She made a decision based on the information available to her. If that information was deliberately manipulated, responsibility belongs with the person who allegedly created the deception. The most important question is not why Charline trusted. It is why someone would allegedly betray that trust. The case can be described in a sentence. 23-year-old woman murdered in 2009. But a sentence cannot contain everything that was lost. There was no second chance. No opportunity for Charline to grow older. Her family grew older for her, and they continued asking questions. Cold cases do not solve themselves. Someone has to keep asking. Someone has to reopen old information. Someone has to reconsider what appeared insignificant years earlier. Someone has to believe that a victim still deserves answers even when the headlines are gone. That is what eventually brought Charline's case back into public attention. And in 2025, the indictment gave the family something they had not had before: a formal accusation against an alleged participant. But it did not provide every answer. One alleged accomplice was already dead. So where does that leave the case? It leaves it in a place between progress and uncertainty. There is progress because an indictment exists. There is uncertainty because an indictment is an allegation. That distinction is important. Justice is not simply about finding someone to blame. Justice is about establishing what happened, who was involved, what they did, why they did it, and whether the evidence proves those allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. Charline deserves that level of truth. Her family deserves it. And the public deserves a careful accounting of the evidence rather than speculation. Because there are still unanswered questions. For more than 15 years, the name Charline Rosemond remained attached to a question. Now that question has a courtroom attached to it. But the courtroom cannot restore the years she lost. It can only determine what the evidence proves. And that is where the story should ultimately belong. Not with sensationalism, not with speculation, not with an invented psychological profile, with evidence, with accountability, and with the memory of a young woman whose life was reduced to a murder investigation before she had the chance to become everything she wanted to be. Charline Rosemond wanted a Lexus. She had saved money. She had plans. She believed she was going somewhere to make a purchase. Instead, she was being led toward an ambush. Now, one of the people accused is finally positioned to answer them in court. But until the evidence is heard and tested, the final chapter has not been written. Until every remaining piece of evidence is brought into the light, part of her final night remains trapped in the darkness. Charline left home expecting to return. She never did, but her name remains. Her family remains. Her story remains. And so does the question: who really led Charline Rosemond to her final destination?